Hey everyone, welcome to evolution. So I know we discussed a little bit about evolution in our first few lectures, but we're really going to dive into evolution and the diversity of life in this unit. So today we're going to talk about how populations change, and that's probably a little bit of review, but then we're going to really get into the mechanisms of evolution. How do populations actually change, and what mechanisms make that happen? And then we'll look at evidence of evolution, historically and nowadays as well. And then we'll finish up with some common misconceptions about evolution, which will also be your discussion topic for this week. So what is evolution, right? Well, it's really the theory of evolution is the unifying theory of biology. So it's really important that we really understand what evolution is and the theory of evolution. Because really we are saying that all species of living organisms have evolved at some point from a different species. So over the lifetime of a species, it's going to have evolved from a different species at some point, right? So what did people know or believe before Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection? So natural selection is one of our mechanisms of evolution. But what did everybody believe before he wrote his book and before everyone understood his theory? Well, they knew that there were extinct species, right? So they have been finding fossils of dinosaurs and species that no longer existed, right? So they knew that. They knew that there were some extinct species that were no longer living today. And they knew that geological change occurred gradually over time, right? Because they knew that mountains and valleys and things like that were changing gradually, right, over time. So they knew that the world was changing. But then they had something that was maybe a little bit wrong when they thought that the inheritance of acquired characteristics happened from generation to generation. So what they thought was that an individual acquired a certain trait or acquired a characteristic that gave them an advantage. And that characteristic was then inherited. So they were very close, but they weren't quite there. Okay, so we know now that it's due to mutations, and you don't acquire a trait or a characteristic over a lifetime, right? Over an individual's lifetime. So that's where they kind of got it wrong, but that's what they believed before Darwin's theory of evolution. So natural selection, being a mechanism of evolution, was actually independently conceived by two different naturalists, or as we think of them, scientists now. We know a lot about Charles Darwin, right? But we don't know quite as much about Alfred Russel Wallace. So we know that Darwin did a lot of his studying on the beagle, right, the HMS Beagle, and he visited a lot of very unique and exotic places such as South America, Australia, and South Africa. But Wallace also was doing a lot of research in the Amazon rainforest and the Malay archipelago. And they both wrote scientific papers on their findings and their research, and they both suggested the same mechanism for evolution, and that is natural selection. So we can't forget about Wallace, even though Darwin was the one that became famous for the theory of evolution. So how do populations change? So this should be a little bit of review. right? So the characteristics of organisms are inherited. And now that we know a lot more about genes and genetics, we know that genes can be passed on from generation to generation, but it's random, right? So there's always going to be variation. So 50-50 chance you're getting one allele over another from a parent, right? So, but they are inherited, they are passed on. There's always going to be more offspring produced than survive, right? Which then leads us to competition, right? And competition for survival. Now, the offspring characteristics are going to vary among each other, right? So now we know why, and we know about genetics and inheritance, right? So we know that we're going to have variation in our gametes, which are going to give us variation in our offspring. So this whole theory is really called descent with modification, meaning that those successful characteristics, right, in whatever environment that may be, are going to pass to the next generation, right? So it's not going to pass to every offspring, but the ones that do get the characteristic are going to then be set up for more success, okay? So that should be a little bit of review for us, right? So, you know, our example of our giraffes, right? So long-necked giraffes are just randomly born, right? But then they are going to have more offspring because they have a more competitive advantage over their short-necked friends, right? So let's give another example that Darwin actually witnessed and studied are the Galapagos finches. So they really help to inspire and demonstrate this theory of evolution. So in Galapagos finches, they have different bill sizes. So they're all finches, but they have some large-billed finches that eat large, hard seeds. So their bills are better adapted for eating those larger seeds, whereas the small-billed birds eat small, soft seeds. Okay, so what happened was, is if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, and you kind of look at how many birds, you know, have smaller beaks versus bigger beaks, you see that there's kind of a median amount, that there's about equal number maybe of, you know, small beak and large beak. But then what happened was is there was a drought in the 70s, in 1976, which caused a decrease in those small soft seeds. So what you actually found was a year later, so 1978, there was actually a shift in the number of large-billed birds, so that became a competitive advantage because they could eat the hard seeds that were still around, whereas those smaller-billed birds died off because they no longer had a food source, right? So just a very realistic and very good example of evolution in real time, right? They could see the effect right away. So the big thing is that natural selection can really only take place if there is variation among individuals in a population, right? If everyone were the same, you wouldn't have the variation and you wouldn't have the differences in characteristics. So there has to be some sort of genetic basis, right? And we've already seen what variation is due to. So we have genetic diversity, right? And that's the variation within a population, and it comes from mutation and sexual reproduction. So again, we went through meiosis and sexual reproduction and how that gives us a lot of variation in a population, but we also have mutation as well to account for the variation and genetic diversity, right? So not everybody looks exactly the same, and that's the same for most populations, right? All individuals are going to have some sort of variation. And that is important because we need that variation for natural selection, which will help us survive over time as a population. So let's look at mutation and sexual reproduction and just review a little bit about how we get variation and genetic diversity from them. So random mutations can have one of three outcomes, right? And we talked a little bit about this already. So depending on the organism's phenotype, right? So if we have a random mutation which will cause a different phenotype, it can have one of three effects. It can reduce fitness, right? So it could have a negative effect on the individual. It could have a beneficial effect on the fitness, right? Or it could have no effect at all on the fitness. So mutations do not necessarily mean a negative or positive effect. It's just going to be random, right? And that just depends on the environment at the time, right? So that's random mutation, and I think we've all pretty much gotten that under our belt. So sexual reproduction also leads to genetic diversity, and we've talked quite a bit about this now after our meiosis and cell division lecture. But we have two different events during meiosis, right? Our crossing over events and our independent assortment, which actually leads to very different combinations of alleles in the gametes. So all four gametes are going to have different genetics, right? And the second part of sexual reproduction is fertilization itself. So out of all of the different gametes, you can have a random combination of the two gametes that actually come together during fertilization and will lead to that new diploid cell. So we know that we have genetic diversity, we have variation. So an adaptation is a heritable trait that aids in the survival and reproduction of an organism in its current environment or present environment, right? So we had an example of our Galapagos finches where the beak size is an adaptation to food availability, right? Or our giraffes is another example with neck length. Okay, so those are adaptations, and the favorable trait can change with the environment, right? So what would happen in the Galapagos finches if something happened to those large, hard seeds, right? And then they would be at a disadvantage with those large beaks. So adaptations can change and the favorable traits can change with the environment. So now let's look at some patterns of evolution and what we've actually seen in populations that change. So we have something called convergent and divergent evolution. So they sound very similar, but they are different. So let's go through divergent evolution first. And this is where we're talking about two different species that have evolved in different directions from a common ancestor or a common point. So for example, the dog and the wolf and maybe the coyote or something like that, right? So they are three different species because they can't interbreed, they can't produce fertile offspring, but they have come from a common ancestor, okay? So that is divergent evolution. And in divergent evolution, we see what are called homologous structures, right? So we've seen homologous chromosomes, right, where they are sharing similarities, genes in the same location. So same thing with homologous structures. They're going to share similarities in structure, even though they are different due to evolutionary divergence. Okay, so for example, if we look at the limb bones of mammals, right? So down here we have four different mammals. We have a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. all very different, right? And we look at their upper limbs. Okay, so we look at our arm, the cat's forelimb, the whale's flipper, and the bat's wing, right? And you look at the bones of that limb and they are what we call homologous, meaning they have the same bones in the same location, right? So you see the finger bones, which are phalanges, you see the radius and the ulna in the forearm, and you see the humerus up into the shoulder. So again, very different species due to divergent evolution, but because they're all mammals, they've come from the same common ancestor, okay? So they've diverged at some point to create different species, but they're all coming from the same common ancestor. So that's divergent evolution, and it's shown through, or examples of that is seen through homologous structures, okay? So let's contrast divergent evolution with convergent evolution. So what's the difference? Well, we have similar structures arising through evolution, but they're independently in different species. Okay, so they don't share a common ancestor. Now we see an example in this in analogous structures. So they're not homologous structures, they're analogous structures, meaning they have similar function, but very different origins of the structure. So that's different from our divergent evolution, where we have a common ancestor and we've diverged, right? Whereas we have completely different ancestors, no common ancestor, but we have evolved a similar functioning structure, okay? So if we look at the falcon, the bat, and the pterodactyl, say, all flying animals, right? We have wings, right? So they have all adapted and all evolved wings, but they're completely different in their ancestor, right? So we have an ancestral bird for the falcon, we have an ancestral mammal for the bat, and a reptile for the pterodactyl. So they're all similar in function, right? They all help them to fly, but the wings are very different in each species because there's no common ancestor. So that's convergent evolution. And I have a video in Canvas as well that kind of helps explain divergent and convergent evolution. So both are patterns of evolution that we see in nature. So interesting enough, Darwin and Wallace were really unaware of the genetics work by Mendel, right? So they completely came up with these theories of evolution without taking into account genetics. But now we know that there's a very strong relationship between natural selection and genetics, and we call that modern synthesis. So essentially it's bringing natural selection and genetics together to explain the theory of evolution. So we now know that we have genetic diversity, right? And a population has a specific genetic makeup. Now, natural selection can affect a population's genetic makeup, and this is the evolution of a population, but we can also see evolution at the species level as well. So when we talk about microevolution, we're talking about the population level. Okay, so how does a population evolve, right? Versus macroevolution, think bigger, we're talking about at the species level. Okay, so evolution of a species. So microevolution is smaller, right, at the population level, and then macroevolution is bigger at the species level. Okay, because you can have multiple populations of a species, right? They may live in different environments. So how does that smaller population evolve versus the entire species evolving. Okay, so that's micro versus macro evolution. So let's talk a little bit more about population genetics. So that's going to be microevolution, right? Studying the outcome of alleles in a population. So evolution can change the frequency of an allele in a population, right? So for example, if we're talking about blood types in humans, if we're looking at it right now, the frequency of the A allele in a population is 26 something percent. And then B is 13% and O is 60.5%. So obviously we have many more O type blood types in a population than we do either A or B. But again, A is a little more frequent than B. So when we talk about allele frequency, they all have to add up to 100%. Okay, so this kind of leads us into the Hardy-Weinberg principle, which we'll talk about in a second. But essentially, when we talk about the frequency of alleles, you have to add up all the frequencies of the different alleles, and when you add it up, it should equal 100%, right? Which that kind of makes sense. Okay, because 100% of the population, and you divide that up and you have your different alleles of the population. But the big thing is that evolution can change those frequencies, right? Okay, so it's not a steady state unless we're talking about the Hardy-Weinberg equation. So what is the Hardy-Weinberg theory? And we're not going to go into the Hardy-Weinberg equations or anything like that, so you may see those in the textbook or in videos that you watch, but we're just going to talk about what the Hardy-Weinberg theory is. And essentially we're just talking about a population's allele and genotype frequencies are inherently stable, right? So if we have no evolutionary forces acting upon the population, those allele frequencies or genotype frequencies are going to stay relatively the same, right? It's just going to pass on from generation to generation, and we'll see those same frequencies in the population, right? So this is obviously a theory, because when we're talking about what's happening in the real world, right, Hardy-Weinberg theory doesn't really uphold. It may uphold in very small populations that don't see any sort of, or very large, I should say very large populations that don't really see a lot of evolutionary force, which that doesn't really happen in life, right? There's going to be some sort of evolutionary force acting upon a population at any given time. So some alleles in the same proportions will carry on through generation to generation, right? So you're going to get that same frequency throughout. But again, we have evolutionary forces happening all the time. So the Hardy-Weinberg theory it's a theory, but it's not too applicable to what is actually happening in life. It is true, right? It is true if that population has no evolutionary force acting upon it, the frequencies will stay stable. So how do we change the allele frequency in a population? So how do we do that? Well, our big mechanism of evolution is natural selection, which is what we have been talking about, right? Where those beneficial phenotypes from any given allele will be in greater frequency in the next generation, because those individuals with that beneficial phenotype will pass it on to the next generation. And we even see that very beneficial alleles actually can become fixed and eventually they will be in every individual. So if it gives this outstanding benefit, fitness benefit, we will actually see it become fixed over time. So my example down here is in moths. So light colored, kind of peppered looking moths are better camouflaged against kind of, pristine or kind of white backgrounds, whereas the dark colored peppered moths are better camouflaged against kind of a darker or sootier environment. And so interestingly enough, as the Industrial Revolution happened in England during the 19th century, the color of the moth population shifted from the light peppered to the dark peppered moth, because with the Industrial Revolution came a lot more soot in the environment, so walls and things became darker colored, so the moths were able to camouflage better with the darker color. So just like we talked about, a very beneficial phenotype can become fixed, we also see the opposite. So detrimental alleles can also become eliminated from the gene pool. So gene pool is just another term for the sum of all alleles in a population, right? So it has to equal 1. Essentially, all the frequencies have to equal 100%. So that represents our gene pool. So essentially, if you have these very detrimental alleles, you can see them eliminated, but it can be very hard because even recessive alleles can stay within a population as carriers, right? So that's how we still have a lot of these detrimental disorders that, don't come up a lot in a population, but they are there, just hiding within the heterozygote individuals. Okay, so, but if it's detrimental enough over time, we can see it become eliminated from the gene pool. So another way to change the allele frequency in a population is mutation. Now, mutation is really the source of new alleles in a population, right? These random mutations, but they really have a small effect on evolution unless it interacts with another factor like selection. So if the mutation gives you an advantage, then you are selected for with natural selection. So mutation really doesn't have that big of an effect on evolution unless it really is selected, that mutation is selected for. Okay, so because again, we said mutation can either cause detrimental effect, negative or positive effect, which then maybe it'll be selected for, or no effect at all, right? So really you only have 1 in 3 chance to really get a positive effect to have a potential for natural selection. So another way we can change the allele frequency is genetic drift. And genetic drift is just the simple effect of chance. So this is really the most important in smaller populations, but drift influences every allele, even the ones that are being naturally selected. Okay, so for example, down here we have a small population of rabbits. And even though we have some brown rabbits and maybe some white rabbits, which would be our variation, say only the left side or those half of rabbits are going to breed, right? So just by chance, they're the ones that are going to breed. And then we get the next generation. So maybe we have less white, right? Because the white individual didn't breed. And then in that next selection, we again get a smaller population of 2 brown rabbits that are going to breed, and then we end up with all brown rabbits, and we don't see that white individual, that white allele anymore. So again, this is how we just can change, and it definitely can affect those recessive alleles quite heavily. in these smaller populations, but it's just simply the effect of chance, okay? And it affects all the alleles, not just the ones being selected for. Now, genetic drift can be magnified in certain scenarios. So what does that mean? We said that it has the most effect on small populations, but in a certain scenario, we have what's called the bottleneck effect, where a large population is wiped out, okay? So a large portion of the population. So this could be a natural disaster or something like that, but essentially you wipe out a large portion of the population, which causes less variation within the population. Okay, so the population will then become more similar to each other because you have less variation. Okay, so the example on the picture is just showing you, an original population. You could call, we're using marbles in this case, but you can talk about organisms as well. So you have an original population, you have some sort of bottlenecking effect, right? So whether that's a natural disaster, or in this case, you essentially don't let out, all the marbles, and the only ones that come out is the surviving quote unquote population. And so you may eliminate some of that variation within a population. So then over time, that population becomes more and more similar, and the genetic drift has even more effect on that population through random breeding, right? But they're going to just become more and more similar over time. Okay, so that's how it gets magnified in this bottleneck scenario. So genetic drift can also be magnified in another scenario called the founder effect. So essentially, if you look at our picture here, or you could think of, the founding fathers of, America as well. That's where the name comes from, right? So you have this ancestral population that may have a lot of variation, a lot of diversity, but essentially the ones that move to a new environment are the founders, right? So now they're the founding parents, and the genetic structure of that new population will match that of the founding parents. So you've eliminated some of the variation within that ancestral population. So then you get genetic drift, which is just the random, the randomness of breeding. And you're going to get more and more similarity within a population to those founding parents. Okay, so just think of founding fathers coming to America when you think of the founder effect, right? So our last way to change the allele frequency in a population is what's called gene flow. And so this is the flow of alleles in and out of a population. So if you think of migration of individuals or gametes, then that is gene flow. Okay, so kind of maybe similar to founding effect, right? Founding, but it's a little bit different because you can have them going in and out of a population. So for example, you have a population of green beetles, and you have one brown beetle that's going to migrate over into that green beetle population. So now you're introducing a new allele into that population, and so you're going to change that allele frequency. Okay. So Darwin also identified a special case of natural selection called sexual selection. So this is happening just within a species. So we have two different forms of sexual selection. The first is having to do with the males. So we have male-male competition for mates. So we see this happen a lot in nature. You see males within a species competing against each other for mates. And the idea is the winner is going to be able to mate with the females and pass on their genes. So we see this very often in harem type populations, right? Especially, I don't know if anyone has ever seen and gone out to see the elephant seals, but they're quite impressive. The males are huge, and they actually get so involved in this male-male competition that they become bloody. So they do fight. Some fight to the death, but usually they don't want to fight to the death. They just want to fight enough to prove who's the winner and who's the loser. So we see this very commonly amongst males in populations. So the other form of sexual selection is the female choice. So the female actually chooses who she will mate with based on a specific set of traits. So then therefore that traits will get passed on to the next generation. And there's kind of two theories for female choice, and that's the sexy sons, whereas she's going to pick a sexy mate, so therefore her sons will then have that sexy trait as well, which will then essentially those genes will be passed on through the generations. Or there's a theory about the good genes theory, saying that the most fit male and the one with the best trait is going to have the best genes, which will then pass those good genes on to the next generation. So I have a video which is kind of fun on Canvas as well with sexual selection, because you get some of these crazy displays for the females within the males, because they're essentially trying to attract the female, trying to prove that they have the best genes and the best traits. So you can look up a lot of really fun videos, especially with birds. Birds have some very cool traits for sexual selection. One of the classic ones is the peacock. And obviously these males are going to have some extravagant traits that may or may not be good for their survival. Because if you think of peacocks and their huge attractive tails, may be bad for attracting predators as well. So think about that and why maybe that may still be an advantage for them to have such a large tail to attract that female. So it's kind of a balancing act between attracting a male, or attracting a predator, and attracting a female. We do see a little bit of male choice as well, but only in species where the male is the one that is going to be caring for and raising the young. So just to review, I really like this picture to show the genetic variations within a population and what can affect the allele frequencies in a population. And that selection is probably going to be one of the major driving forces for allele frequency change and can lead to adaptation. But we have talked about mutation, which really doesn't change it too much unless it's working with selection. And then we've seen migration, where we get some gene flow from other populations to alter a frequency of the allele. And then we also have genetic drift, and that's just a random change in the allele frequency. And this is mostly seen in those smaller populations. And we see it really amplified in those two scenarios where we have a bottleneck effect or a founder event, okay, a founder effect. So these are all going to change the allele frequencies, and when we change the allele frequencies, we are then going to evolve that population. So what is some evidence of evolution through our history and even today? So the first one is fossils, right? So we have fossil evidence that organisms were very different millions of years ago from what they are today. So we can see those gradual changes in our fossil history. So, you know, all of our species are going to have a fossil history, and they're going to be very different from what they were millions of years ago. And so this is just an example of the horse right? And the fossil ancestry of the horse, all the way back to 55 million years ago. And so we have fossil records of all these steps and changes of that species throughout history, which is really kind of cool to think about, right? So more evidence of evolution we can see through anatomy. So animals from different species actually share a very same basic structure. And this is evidence of a common ancestor. So we've already talked about homologous structures, especially in the limb bones of mammals, right? So they share the same structure of their limbs with those bones. So we've also seen this in vestigial structures as well. So vestigial structures are structures that no longer serve a purpose. So you may find a vestigial structure in an animal and say, why do they even have that anatomical structure? Because it no longer serves a purpose. Well, it just proves that maybe an ancestor of that species did have that structure and it did serve a purpose at some point. So I have a very cool picture here, and not many people know this about horses. Obviously all my background is in horses, but if you look at the anatomical structure of a horse's leg, they're actually standing on their middle finger. Okay, so obviously they've lost all their other fingers over time, right? So they're only standing on their middle finger. In their cannon bone area, which is in yellow there, their metacarpal bones, which is our palm bones, they have that middle metacarpal bone. And on either side of that, they actually have two other metacarpal bones called splint bones. And they are vestigial structures. They serve no purpose whatsoever for the horse. There's no weight bearing for that. They can actually cause some trouble in horses. So again, this is a vestigial structure, and unless they had an ancestor, which they do, that had 3 toes at some point, that wouldn't make any sense for them to have those bones in that location. So again, those are vestigial structures, and we see it all the time in different animals. So some more evidence is convergent evolution itself. So these are those similar structures based just on the environmental pressures. There's no common ancestor between the species, but they have developed similar structures because they live in the same environment. And so these are those analogous structures where they share a similar function. So for another example of analogous structures, because we used wings earlier, is the Arctic fox and the Arctic pigeon. So they're both white in color. They obviously don't share a common ancestor. One is a mammal and one is a bird, but they have white fur and white feathers. So again, they live in the Arctic where their environment is white. And so for their survival, having an adaptation of white fur and white feathers gave them an advantage over time. So that would be convergent evolution with these analogous structures. So some more evidence of evolution is in embryology. So you can take whole classes on embryological development, but essentially organisms are very similar in their embryological development, even if they lose those structures later in their life or later in the development. So we're talking across species, even species with no recent common ancestor. So for example, we have all these vertebrate embryos in this picture. They all have gill slits and tails at some point in early development. And if you look at the first row, you cannot tell the difference between a fish embryo and a human embryo, right? So they look very, very similar, right? And then they're going to slowly develop into the species that they will become. So obviously humans and birds lose those gill slits and tails, but obviously our reptiles, amphibian and fish friends, some are going to keep their gills, they may all keep their tails, right? So it's going to share this common embryological development across all vertebrates. And you see this across most species too as well. So this embryological development is very similar. Now, we've already talked about the genetic code being a universal code across all species. So within molecular biology, there is evidence of a common ancestor for all life, right? And that is shown in that universality of DNA. So really, the genetic code means the same for all species. So all the cells are all going to produce the same proteins due to the same DNA base code, right? So that's just very cool to think about, right? So we've all developed from this same basic genetic code. From some common ancestor for all of life. So now that we know that there's quite a bit of evidence out there for evolution, and evolution is a theory, right? And we talked about scientific theories out there, and a lot of people still don't believe in evolution, and that's okay, right? Everyone can have their own beliefs, but within the scientific world, the theory of evolution is a fact. And there still are common misconceptions of evolution. Even if you believe in evolution, some people don't really understand evolution to the extent that you guys are now going to understand evolution, because older concepts have now been changed, but those ideas have kind of stuck around, which is what causes these misconceptions of evolution. So I want you guys to watch the video for the misconceptions of evolution, and you guys are going to discuss it as well in your assignment this week. So what is our first common misconception? And that is that evolution is just a theory, right? But in science, a theory is a concept that has been extensively tested and supported over time. So it doesn't just mean that it's an idea or a thought, right? It's a theory. I have a theory about something or an opinion about something. No, this is a scientific theory, and we've now studied and understand what a scientific theory actually entails, right? So another common misconception is that individuals evolve. And now we know that individuals do not change as they age. It's going to be populations that are going to change and evolve over time, because it's the mutations and the variations within the individuals that may or may not give them an advantage, right? So it doesn't have anything to do with the individual evolving, as well as the individual or the populations or organisms or any of them have any sort of say on the evolution. So organisms don't evolve on purpose, right? So populations adapt to their environments, not because they want to, but because they have to, right? For survival. So it's a survival mechanism, not a want, okay? So that's a common misconception, that organisms want to evolve or evolve on purpose. So the other common misconception is that evolution explains the origin of life. The theory does not try to explain the origin of life. It explains how species have changed over time in response to their changing environment. Okay, so we know that all life probably has a common ancestor, but that doesn't mean we know where that common ancestor came from, right? So that is a common misconception as well. So there's another misconception that evolution is controversial among scientists. So if you actually poll scientists, which they did, they polled 2,500 scientists in 2009. There's probably a more recent study than that, but 97% of scientists believe that species evolve, right? So they believe in the theory of evolution. And that's what I was saying before, is that in the scientific world, the theory of evolution is an accepted concept. And another misconception is that other theories should be taught in public schools, but there really are no other viable scientific theories at this time, right? So you may say that intelligent design or creationism are theories, but they're religious theories, and they really have no basis in scientific theory, and that's okay if people believe in intelligent design or creationism, but they have no place in public schools because it's against the First Amendment of the Constitution, where we have to separate church and state. So that's fine, and I'm not trying to convince anyone one way or the other, but I'm just saying this is a common misconception and an argument among some people, right? And that's okay. But there really are no other viable scientific theories for how populations change over time. All right, let's finish up with a little bit of review that you guys can do on your own and make sure you're able to answer these questions. So what is the difference between divergent and convergent evolution? And again, I have a video on that. What are the four mechanisms of how allele frequencies change within a population, right? Which all lead to evolution. What are some examples of evidence for evolution, right? What did we talk about in life and in history that we have seen show the evidence for evolution? And then what are some common misconceptions about evolution, right, and why they are incorrect? Okay, so go ahead and finish up. You can answer those questions on your review. I know I don't have them written out for you, but go ahead and fill them out and make sure you're able to answer these. And if you have any questions on it, feel free to email me or drop by in office hours. All right, I'll see you guys later. Bye.